Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Iowa Learning Farms 2024 Conservation Webinar Series. We're thrilled to have with us today Robyn Wilson, Professor of Risk and Analysis and Decision Science from the Ohio State University, talking today about motivational barriers to implementing conservation. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting topic, and I hope you all have a lot of questions as we'll do Q&A at the end. And anytime you have a question, you can feel free to put that in the chat. And with that, I will turn the virtual floor over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Liz. I'm going to restart my time and do my best to keep an eye. I told Liz to cut me off if I seem to have lost track of time. But thanks for having me. I'm excited to be joining you all virtually today from my home office in Columbus. I am going to try to cover kind of three main things today. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about this observed intention behavior gap. It's a very common thing in human existence. It's also something we see in the farmer conservation context, where we have people with really good intentions, perhaps goals related to conservation, but their behavior is not in line with that. And I'll talk about some data that demonstrates that gap from work I've done in the Western Lake Erie Basin. A lot of the work I've done with farmers has generally been in the Eastern Corn Belt and the Great Lakes region. So a little further east than some of you, but I think a lot of widely applicable lessons, even where the climate context is a bit different in the farming context. And then I'll talk about how we could close that gap. So I'll talk a little bit about what we know from the literature are some of the barriers to why people can't follow through on those good intentions. And then I'll try to talk about some things that I don't think get talked about in the conservation literature enough, but are very prevalent in the more, the broader behavioral science literature. And then I'll end with just an example of some of the work that we're doing here in Ohio to try to test out some more innovative interventions meant to help people close that gap between their good intentions and behavior. And in this case, kind of identity as a conservationist, as a farmer, goals around conservation, but then actually seeing those in-field practices in particular in place. So the intention behavior gap, again, I'm just going to share some data that I think kind of demonstrates this from farmers largely in the Western Lake Erie Basin. And so what you're seeing here in this figure, we have cover crops and subsurface placement as two recommended practices here in Ohio that have been really promoted as critical to water quality challenges in the Great Lakes. And the y-axis is showing you the percent of farmers in each category of adoption. Dark gray is the average reported adoption over time from farmers we followed over a 2-year period. Light gray is the average intended adoption. And so essentially what you're seeing is a little gap where about 30 to 40% of our farmers are saying, I intend to do cover crops. I intend to do subsurface placement. In fact, in this study, we said, what are your plans next year? And these are people who said, yes, I will be doing this on some proportion of my acreage. But when you see the gap between that light gray and the dark gray, you see that most of them are not following through with that. So from a behavioral science standpoint, we would say these are kind of the middle adopters, right? These are those folks who are interested, thinking about it, in fact, intend to do it, but just haven't followed through. You might notice that there's still a good 30 to 40% who are not on this graph. And these are the people who just really aren't interested, right? These are the ones who are saying, I'm not doing it. I don't plan to do it. And I would argue that should not be the focus of our engagement and our outreach efforts. We should focus on this 30 to 40% in the middle. So when we ask ourselves why that gap exists across my own research program, similar research programs across the Midwest, we've looked at a lot of different things, right, to try to understand that gap. We've looked at characteristics of the farm, so something like the size of the farm. We've looked at characteristics of the farmer, so this might be their identity as a farmer. Do they value conservation over production, production over conservation? Do they value the two equally? And then beliefs that they might have about some of these practices we're promoting. So beliefs about the feasibility of the promoted practices, or perhaps the effectiveness of those practices at achieving their goals on farm or off farm, downstream goals. And across a variety of studies, and working with these populations, one particular set of factors really seem to rise to the top as the best explanation of this gap. And that's the perceived practice, feasibility, and effectiveness. So essentially what we've seen across multiple studies is that the farmers who are already doing these things have the highest or the strongest beliefs around these practices, believing they're feasible, believing they're effective at achieving nutrient loss reduction goals, at achieving water quality goals, and even maybe achieving, yield or profit-based goals. Those folks in the middle, that 30 to 40%, are a little lower on those scales. They have kind of moderate belief in the feasibility and effectiveness of those practices. And then those individuals who really aren't interested have very low perceived feasibility and effectiveness. And time again, we've seen that if we could increase that, those beliefs around one's ability to implement the practices and the extent to which they would work, we would see more adoption, right? There'd be a greater probability of adoption. And in fact, we see that farmers with high, so imagine a scale of 1 to 10, these are farmers scoring kind of an 8 and a 9 on that scale, versus low, farmers scoring maybe a 2 on average. Farmers with that high versus low perceived feasibility and effectiveness are 10 to 15 times more likely to already have a practice in place. So we're doing some work now trying to understand that relationship. Is it that farmers start to believe in these things and then are willing to go out and do it and stick with it? Or is it that once they've started to do it, right, there's a reinforcing loop there where they start to realize it is feasible and effective? And so we're still trying to tease that out, but there certainly is a strong, correlation between those two pieces. So when we talk about trying to close that gap, if we know the gap exists, if we know it could be tied to these beliefs around practice feasibility and effectiveness, what are the strategies that we have available to us? And what do we know we can do to try to close that gap? So again, we're talking about this gap between perhaps pro-conservation intentions and pro-conservation behavior. Or in the social psychology literature, they might say goal commitment, high goal commitment to conservation, right, to soil and water quality, and then behaviors that would follow through with that. And the literature would say there's two things that will either create that gap or close that gap. It's the motivation that the individual holds, and it's the opportunity they have to act on that motivation. And I'm going to talk through some of what we know might fall into those two categories from the broader conservation literature. And then again, talk a little bit more about some things that I think we don't think about enough that might also help to close that gap. So I'm going to come back to that idea of motivation and opportunity. I'm going to kind of reframe some of what I'm about to talk about here in light of those two categories. But first, I wanted to just highlight, this is a pretty recent meta-analysis that tried to look across the studies of farmer conservation adoption, trying to understand what are some of those consistent positive predictors of having these recommended practices in place. And what I've pulled out of that study in particular are those predictors that were positive predictors 20% of the time, right? And so some of those were farm characteristics, so farm size, diversity, environmental vulnerability, right? Bigger farms tend to do more conservation, could have to do with resource constraints. Farms that are more diverse tend to do more conservation. Farms that have obvious environmental vulnerabilities tend to do more conservation. Those studies have also looked at these farmer characteristics, right? Education, past behavior, program, practice-specific knowledge, tendency to seek out information. And again, they find that individuals with more formal education tend to do more conservation. Maybe they've learned more about these sorts of things through that formal education process. Past behavior is often a predictor of future behavior. This, again, is a common thing in behavioral science broadly. So people who have done it in the past do have a greater likelihood to do it in the future. Those with more program or practice-specific knowledge are more likely to do conservation. And those who are more actively seeking out information, and some of that work is really looking at being in the right networks, right? The people who show up at the conservation office more often, the people who are in those conversations with other conservationists, those are the ones who are doing more conservation. And those studies have also looked at specific beliefs that farmers might have. And again, they see this positive effect 20% of the time in terms of attitudes towards the program or practice, the identity of that farmer as a conservationist or a kind of altruistic oriented person, and a belief that there would be a positive impact on yield. So again, farmers with more positive attitudes towards those federal, state, local programs towards those practices, who have those stronger conservation or kind of altruistic identities, and who believe that not just there would be no impact on yield, but there would in fact be a positive impact, right? More likely to do these things. So we can take those kind of categories of factors from the broader literature and kind of reframe them into what some of these barriers might be that prevent someone from following through on those good intentions. So some of those motivational barriers might be a weak conservation identity. A farmer who just doesn't believe that good farmers care a lot about local waterways, right? Or worry about soil health. The good news is there aren't too many farmers that feel that way. We tend to have a pretty positive bias towards strong conservation identities in the farming population. Maybe a lack of formal education because they're not getting that exposure, perhaps to systems thinking, right? Or to some of these other ways of knowing that might be different than what they grew up with. Those negative attitudes, right? So if I don't understand the practice, if I think there will be a negative impact on yield, then I'm going to have a negative attitude towards that practice or towards the program because I think the paperwork is too burdensome, right? Or it's too restrictive. Those sorts of things are barriers. And on the opportunity side, operating a small farm is a barrier, right? So there's the economies of scale issue that allows some of those bigger farms to invest in new equipment and perhaps be able to pay it off quicker, right? With the savings, say from, I don't know, some sort of subsurface application implement, like strip till. Not having an obvious vulnerability. So if you live in a really flat place and you're not seeing erosion or runoff, right, you're just not as motivated. And then the tendency to not seek out information or engage in those quote unquote right networks, those conservation networks, right? These are all barriers that we already know a little bit about. There's already conversations about how to address these, and we should continue to think about that. But again, I think there are some of these motivational barriers that perhaps we aren't thinking about as much, and we should put a little more energy into thinking about moving forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the broader behavioral science literature. So again, kind of stepping away from these lessons we've learned from the farmer-specific conservation studies, and thinking kind of more broadly from the literature in social psychology. And again, what that literature would say is if you have a positive intention, or again, we could call this a commitment to conservation goals, that will lead to consistent behavior if you are motivated to make a plan. So a plan to get from A to B, right? From not doing cover crops to doing cover crops every year on all my acres. Just thinking about that might be overwhelming for some people to think about. So first we have to be motivated to make that plan of how to get from A to B. If we do that, and we receive appropriate feedback about the impacts of our actions, we'll then perceive fewer barriers, we'll perceive more success, and then we'll also be motivated to persist. So this literature would argue that two of the big motivational barriers that might disrupt this connection between good intentions and behavior is just that first step of just making a plan and figuring out where to start, right? And then that motivation to persist when I've tried it. If I'm not getting positive feedback, I'm going to feel like those barriers are still there. I'm going to feel like it's not worth it, and I'm going to quit doing it. And so we might need to think more about these pieces of the puzzle and how we help farmers make the types of plans that they need to get from A to B, and how we provide that feedback that they need in order to want to persist in the practices. And I'm going to talk about some examples of both of those things. So I'm making up two exemplars. These are stock photos. These are not real farmers. Well, maybe they are, but they're stock photos from the internet. So going back to that data I showed you at the beginning, right? About a third of farmers are doing conservation consistently over time. About a third have good intentions but aren't following through. And about a third are really kind of uninterested. So John is our low conservationist. He's in this third that's kind of uninterested. And the problem with John is he just doesn't even have this commitment to conservation goals, right? He doesn't have intentions to engage in conservation. He's not committed to those goals. And the argument is we just don't engage John, right? So John is not the target of our outreach and our engagement. John is someone who maybe over time, as these things become more popular and more of the norm, maybe John gets on board eventually. He's kind of in that laggard category. but he's not the focus of our near-term efforts. But Brad, right? We're going to call Brad our high conservationist. Brad's sporting his Pheasants Forever shirt, right? It's kind of a symbol of his conservation interests. In reality, Brad is about 70% of our farmers, right? Brad is the strong majority of our farmers. They are individuals who are already engaging in conservation or want to in the future or want to do more of it. They have these positive intentions in place. Yet we know while 70% of them have those positive intentions, only about half of them are really managing to follow through. So maybe Brad just doesn't know where to start, right? Brad needs someone to come along and kind of help him make that plan of how he's going to get from his status quo to whatever his kind of ideal future is. Or maybe Brad has a plan, but maybe Brad's been trying out some things and he's just running into problems. He's not getting feedback about the positive or negative outcomes of what he's doing. And so Brad just doesn't want to keep doing it, right? And this is, in my opinion, kind of the classic cover crop story where I live, where a lot of people will try it. They'll sign up for, a 3-year program, but when those incentives end, they're done. They're not persisting. And so we have to think about how many of our Brads need help with this kind of planning piece versus getting that feedback to want to continue and persist. So how can we do that? How can we encourage motivation in these ways? We can help them make plans. And I don't just mean a nutrient management plan. I don't just mean like a traditional conservation plan. I'll talk about what I mean by this. But it's reflecting on our values and what's important to us. It's identifying how what we're doing is discrepant or not in line with our values. It's then mapping out, how do I get from A to B step by step by step by step? And when I run into this barrier, what am I going to do? When I run into that barrier, what am I going to do? Because as humans, just thinking about all the steps that we have to take is overwhelming. I'm sure we can all think of examples of good intentions in our own lives that don't lead to behavior because we're not sure where to start. Or perhaps we get started and we run into a problem and we didn't have a plan for how to navigate that, and so we quit, right? Or maybe we stick with it, but we're not getting that positive feedback that it's worth it, so we quit. And so we really need to help people up front with those plans. And then once they've engaged, we need to demonstrate that the progress is being made, right? Because that's the only way we eventually get to that motivation to persist, or this idea that I'm not just going to try it once or sign up for this program once, but I'm going to keep doing it. I like to use the example of diet and exercise because I think it resonates with everyone, regardless of your background. If you intend to lose weight or eat healthy, but you don't have a plan in place, it's never going to happen. If you have a plan in place, but you didn't think about how you were going to overcome the challenge of getting up earlier to work out in the morning before you take your kids to school, you're going to quit. If you work out for 3 months and you see no change in the scales or how your clothes are fitting, you're going to quit, right? And so we can think about that same example in the context of farmers and conservation. And of course, we need to continue to remove those other barriers that we already know quite a bit about, right? We don't have enough technical assistance. We do need to provide incentives, at least in the near term, to get over that initial hump, right? So we still need to do those things, but we also, I think, need to think about these other pieces. So I think I'm doing great on time, which makes me happy. I'm going to talk a little bit to wrap up here with some kind of innovative tests of these ideas that we're doing here in Ohio right now. So we're experimenting with if-then plans, values-based if-then plans, and I'll talk about that, and providing more meaningful feedback for behavioral persistence in the ag conservation context. And we're actually doing this in cooperation with a pretty big interdisciplinary team, but including some social psychologists who study these sorts of things and have seen a lot of success with them in other contexts. So the one project that I'll just talk about briefly is the Pilot Watershed Project. So here we're testing the effect of unique economic, social, and behavioral interventions on conservation adoption and persistence. The goal of this project is to increase adoption of recommended practices from about 30% of the acres in our treatment watershed to about 70% of the acres, and to then test the effect of increased adoption of these recommended practices on soil health and water quality. So while we are supporting and providing financial assistance for a variety of practices, one big target practice in this project is subsurface placement of fertilizer. This is a paired design. Again, it's a big interdisciplinary team led by Jay Martin, who's one of our food, ag, and bioengineers here at Ohio State. You can see the two watersheds here. Shallow Run is our treatment watershed, and this kind of bottom half of this bigger watershed, Potato Run, is our control watershed. And we're doing a lot of things here. For one, we are basically trying to remove every possible barrier that we know exists on the opportunity side of this equation. So we have kind of unlimited one-on-one technical assistance. When we're talking at the scale of this watershed here, we're really talking 30 to 35 operations. And so we can provide a really tailored one-on-one assistance through staffing that was funded through this program. This is a big partnership project through the Foundation for Food and Ag Research and the RCPP. And so we're providing this unlimited one-on-one technical assistance. We're also providing agglomeration incentives. So essentially, farmers can get paid way more than they typically do. And as more people engage, those payments go up. And the goal there is to encourage farmers to encourage each other to participate. So we're doing those opportunity interventions. The argument, again, being let's remove all of those typical, I want to say excuses, but that feels negative. Those typical reasons we hear that people are not able to follow through on those good intentions, right? You've got all the technical support you need, plenty of financing to support this. And then we're layering in some of these motivational interventions. So in order to recruit and even engage farmers in our treatment watershed in a conversation about joining this project, we're doing values-focused planning. So we're having each individual sit down and think about why they do or might engage in conservation, how what they're currently doing is consistent or not with those values, and then how to move forward through an if-then plan. So again, here's all the steps I'm going to take. Maybe first I have to talk to someone about cover crop seeding, right? And then I have to buy the seed. And then I have to decide how I'm going to apply that. Am I flying it in, right? So we're helping them develop the whole plan. And we're thinking through all the things that might kind of get in the way along that path and what they're going to do when they run into that barrier. So when those barriers come, and they will, they'll be prepared with a plan B, a plan C. And then we're also providing annual feedback. So on the increasing numbers of acres and participants in the project, on changes in those environmental outcomes. So we're measuring nutrient loss, we're measuring water quality, we're measuring soil health, we're tracking yield. So basically any sort of metric that we think would indicate what positive or negative impact their actions are having, we're providing that on an annual basis to, again, kind of energize and get people feeling like, okay, something good is happening. I should continue doing this, even when the project ends, right? This is a 5-year project with a lot of funding, but at some point that funding goes away. And the goal is then to track what happens after that funding ends as well. So takeaways, just to wrap up, and then I'll let Liz cover a few things and have plenty of time for questions. Many farmers are motivated. I think this is true across the Midwest. I don't think this is unique to the Western Lake Erie Basin, to the Great Lakes, to the Eastern Corn Belt, to the Western Corn Belt. Many farmers are motivated, but they may struggle to maintain that motivation given the barriers that they're facing. Reminding people of their values, creating these if-then plans, demonstrating progress towards goals can increase motivation and not just get that initial step of closing the gap from good intentions to behavior, but also create that persistence or that change over time. So one of our big challenges in some of the studies we've done is that when we track the rate of change over time at a small scale, so you can see that with like NASS data, what the rate of change is over time, and it's small, right? It's like in some places a 0% increase in acres over time, some places a little higher, up to a couple percent in say like Maryland or places east. But in some of our studies, we've seen a 0% rate of change. And it's not that there aren't new people trying things for the first time. It's that equal numbers of farmers are quitting. And so the new people are replacing the ones who quit, and we're never getting that kind of energy and that increase in individuals or acres in these practices. Barriers can decrease motivation. So paperwork, narrow profit margins, time, equipment, uncertainty in the benefits, rental acreage, right? We know a lot of these exist. And we still need to be thinking creatively about how we design programs to minimize those, right? And to solve a lot of these challenges. But regardless of where those main barriers are, the most progress will be made by motivating the motivated, right? Making conservation as easy as possible, drilling down on that middle third who really want to do this but are finding it hard to make it a reality, and figuring out what is really stopping them from taking action. So I'll stop with that. The QR code will just take you to my lab website, which is also over here on the other side of the screen. If you're interested in reading more about some of our projects, you're also welcome to email me with questions. I guess that's not Twitter anymore, but that's my Twitter account, which is my work-related social media. It should be an X now. And just want to acknowledge the funding and the collaborators on these projects. I don't do anything in isolation. These are all very collaborative projects, not only with my own team, but with these broader interdisciplinary teams I'm a part of. So just a big thank you to everyone who's not listed here as well. The individuals listed are some of my individuals from my lab over the last several years. And of course, to funders, to USDA, to the National Science Foundation, the 4R Research Fund. Some of that tracking change over time came through that funding source. So definitely couldn't do this without all of that support. So I will stop there and hand it over to Liz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. If you watched today's webinar and would like to receive a CCA CEU, you are invited to email Elena Whitaker, that's ALENAW @iastate.edu by this evening at 5 p.m. Central Time with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, if it's different than what your CCA CEU name is number is registered to, and then including that number in that email. And we will get that submitted for you. You can go ahead to the next one, which I believe, yes, is our demographic survey. So if you have attended a previous Iowa Learning Farms webinar and have completed this survey, thank you. If you have not yet, we do ask that you help us track this information as a USDA funded program. You can access this survey by visiting iowalearningfarms.org/survey or pulling up your phone and pulling up that survey on your phone with that QR code. And you only need to submit a response once for the 2024 calendar year. All right. And then next week, as our webinar series continues, we'll be talking about conservation practices through the lens of weather extremes and climate adaptation with Justin Glisson. He is our state climatologist with our Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. And like all of our previous webinars, today's webinar is recorded and will be available online. You can find all of those webinars by visiting our website at iowalearningfarms.org/webinars. And by request, we have also started to upload our webinars to YouTube, where you can find them sorted by year and topic and playlists. So with that, we have had a series of questions come in for Dr. Wilson. The first is, what is the timing to have in your pilot study? What is the timing to have these value-focused planning meetings with the producers?
So time, I'm not sure if I understand the question. So like how long does it take to do it, or when do you do it in the process? Or I could maybe address both.
Maybe address both. I read it first as like when in the calendar year, but also how long maybe do these take?
Yeah. So in the pilot watershed project, where again, we're testing this out and trying to measure whether or not it's having that kind of value add that we think it could have based on theory and past research outside of this context. We are running a series of meetings in the winter, right? The classic time where we feel like we can catch farmers. We are inviting them to lunch at a local place where it's very easy for them to come. We provide lunch. We talk a little bit about the pilot watershed program and the resources available to them and what it's supporting. And then we do go through this kind of values reflection small planning process, and then we follow up with a more in-depth planning process if they decide to participate in the project. I can provide examples of that. I saw there was one question in the chat about like templates or examples. I'd be happy to do that. We're actually testing out another sort of narratives and building your own kind of narrative as an example of this in a project with the Nature Conservancy. So I could share that too, where essentially there's these 4 pieces that people reflect on, and then it becomes their own narrative. And I can share examples of it that farmers have developed. So yeah, it's kind of like I said, we're testing it out. So you'll have to stay tuned for whether or not it works the way that we think it should. But I'd be happy to share that.
And so, as moderator, my prerogative to ask the follow-up question. So you're having these lunch meetings, and those are small group, and then following up with individual sessions to dive in deeper. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a small group to kind of promote the project, to do the initial reflection exercise, with the hypothesis being that even, and again, this is as humans, this isn't unique to farmers, when we sit back and we think about what's really important to us, in that moment, we're much more motivated and excited to do the thing, right? But then life happens and we get busy and other things get in the way, and we kind of forget that I do care about my long-term health, right? Or I do care about all these other things that are easy to put on the back burner. And so, yes, we start in this kind of group, pretty short exercise, and then we do the one-on-one follow-ups. And again, in this project, they get paired up with someone who helps them go through a pretty extensive planning process and thinking about what's appropriate for their farm.
And as a follow-up to that question, they were curious if you have any goals on tracking the effects of the community or watershed on change of adoption. So how you're going to look from that about 30 is what you said is your baseline to getting to 70.
Yeah, so that is the goal, is to get to 70% of the acres. Now, that doesn't mean 70% of the people, right? And so if we got a handful of the really big farms, that would put a big dent in that number. So we are tracking both. And the reason we're tracking both is from an environmental quality standpoint, the acres matter, obviously. So the engineers really care about that, and the soil scientists. But from a normative standpoint, the people matter. And so I don't want just the big farms to do it. I want everyone to do it, because otherwise you don't shift the norm, right? And so if 40% of your farms participate and get you to 70% of your acres, that's not a long-term outcome. Because that's not communicating that the norm is, right, that we do this, that the majority do this. So we're incentivizing the agglomeration payments. The payments get bigger as the acres enrolled go up, but we're also providing a community benefit that I didn't actually talk about, where as the number of people participating goes up, the community gets a financial reward or benefit to invest in how they want to do, however they want to. And so it's up to $10,000 per year. And so we've worked with like the local villages and said, okay, you know, at a minimum, we'll give you $2,000 to invest in the playground or the library, or buy free ice cream for everyone. It's up to you, right? But as the number of individuals participating goes up, that number goes up and maxes out at 10,000. And so we're trying to incentivize not just acres, but operations or people as well.
And can you talk a little bit more about your different forms of communication? Obviously, you're doing interviews, but are you doing like listening sessions, surveys? What's the extent of your contacts with these producers and people in the community?
Yeah, so it's annual surveys to track our main dependent variables, right? So to track changes in the practices, to track changes in beliefs, to track, and I'm happy to share some of this with people too. One of the things we measure, because in behavioral science, energization is this idea that I did this thing and it's going great and I'm real excited to keep doing it. And so we have a whole set of these dependent variables that we have hypothesized a positive effect on those variables from these interventions. And so we're measuring that annually because the decisions are annual. The measurements and the feedback we can give are on an annual basis. So then every winter, we follow back up, have them fill out another one of these longitudinal surveys. So it's a panel study, right? We're just tracking people over time with an annual data point. But we're doing the feedback interventions in person if we can, because we think that's better than just a mailer showing up and like reading a brochure. So we're doing those same winter meetings. And for everyone that comes to that, they'll get the kind of live with Q&A, feedback And for people who don't come, we will still send that to them via the mail, but we're trying to do as much of that in person as we can.
So this question's talking about kind of related to our next webinar and the impact of weather. But when documenting annual changes, if you track yield and then a poor weather year occurs, do you compare the new practice with the control practice, or do you justify the reduced yield to the poor weather? Maybe that's more of your engineering teams.
It's more of the engineering and soils folks to answer, right? But a lot of the engineers that are running this are SWAT modelers, and right, you can control for those sorts of things. So I don't want to speak for all of them right now, but I would assume, in addition to measuring kind of edge of field metrics, measuring nitrogen and phosphorus. I guess I didn't mention this. Those two watersheds are in a long-term water quality monitoring network through Heidelberg University. And so we have decades of water quality data from multiple points in both of those watersheds. So when you think about it that way, you can control for that, right? You can be looking at weather data along with those water quality metrics over literal decades, and then including these 5 years of the program. And then be able to tease out those signals and know to what extent fluctuations are weather driven versus change in practice driven. The one challenge, and again, this might be more for the physical scientists who might be listening, but one of those challenges is just the period of time in which we're measuring the effect of the treatment. It's going to be pretty short relative to decades of ongoing monitoring. So I don't know how easy it is to tease out that signal. Like maybe it won't be enough years. I feel like that's a real possibility. But they do plan to use the data because this is, I'm not exaggerating, it's like a $15 million project to engage 35 farms in one watershed, right? Because the control, we're the only ones measuring anything. The social science team is like tracking baseline and change over time to, again, maybe control for some of those confounding factors of what's driving the change. But they're not doing soil health monitoring. They're not doing what, we have the long-term water quality monitoring, but they're not doing anything additional in the control watershed. So our team is going to continue to measure things for 3 years. So we'll have the 5 years of the project. And then the behavioral team is going to send out those annual surveys for 3 more years because we're really interested in what happens when the program ends, right? When the incentives end, the technical assistance ends. Like, have we built up enough goodwill, energization, shifts in social norms such that when all this other stuff goes away, people still do it? So that's like the big question we're interested in. And then I imagine our engineering and soils teams would then use the data they've collected to inform modeling exercises as well, which might allow them to kind of play out scenarios over time beyond the timeline of the project.
So there's a question here, kind of like who is making up the team? Who are the motivators? Who are these folks meeting with them? And is there training for them? With a comment that many county NRCS office staff are overloaded with program applications currently.
Yes, this is a problem everywhere, right? Especially with the Inflation Reduction Act and all the money funneling everywhere all at once. So yes, we are partnered with the soil and water districts and with other local partners in the 2 counties, but we hired new people. So while they're on our advisory boards, while they're very much engaged and they are doing some of that work, we have, for instance, a brand new person whose full-time job in the treatment watershed is to talk to people and have those conversations and is just dedicated to doing that for this project.
And there's someone joining in from Wisconsin that also agreed with your dissemination of where farmers are in their decision process of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So your comment to this is not isolated to this,
yes,
basin is resonating with folks.
We do have Wisconsin data because we've got a Great Lakes regional project and an Eastern Corn Belt project. So I don't personally have Iowa data, but I've got everything else to the east, right? And we see the same trend. So Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, like same trend.
So I think this question about crop residue is maybe something you can relay to the team, but there's a question here about where there's land coverage with crop residue, does this come a question for concern for using cover crops? And so is that something that you're hearing from some of the folks as a barrier when it comes to like soil warmth and seed emergence? Is that something that
I haven't
Okay.
heard specific to this project, people bringing that up. I do know that you hear this is again one of those specific beliefs that you might hear on occasion. We have another project where called Farmer Advocates for Conservation, where a group of about 20 farmers have been trained to just do peer-to-peer engagement, with neighbors and community members. And when we were designing the evaluation survey for that project to try to understand whether or not there was this positive impact of the peer engagement on the decisions of others, one of the exercises we did with our advocates is we said, make a list of the things you hear people say that drive you crazy. And they came up with a really great, which I can share this too, a really great list of like 12 beliefs, statements that they'll hear people say that in their opinion are not accurate, right? That from their standpoint, that is not true. Some of them had to do with issues of residue and disease and just all kind, right? So certainly we hear those things. I have not heard it uniquely as part of this project.
And there's still time to get some more questions in. So folks, if you want to get one of your questions in, we've got one more here. With the number of our Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship's incentive programs, they're limited to 1 or 2 years. Based on what you've learned so far, would longer payment incentive periods improve adoption?
Yes. This is one of my critiques that I share a lot is, again, I'm just going to go back to just being a behavioral scientist. This is not unique to conservation, but the problem with paying people, so this is a sidebar. Hopefully I have time for a quick sidebar. The problem with paying people is you take what someone was intrinsically motivated to do and you replace it with extrinsic motivation, right? So 70% of our farmers are intrinsically motivated to do conservation. They're like, yes, this is important to me. I'm a good farmer. Good farmers do conservation, right? All of that. The minute you start paying someone, and this is not unique to them, suddenly it's like, well, I'm doing this because I'm getting paid. And so then when the payment goes away, you're like, well, why would I keep doing this? I'm not getting paid anymore. And this is a classic behavioral problem. And so there's several ways, and I could share a paper on this if people are interested, but I've got another line of research with one of my PhD students right now where we're looking specifically at how do you pay someone to do something in the short term, but then when that payment goes away, make sure you've maintained that intrinsic motivation so that they'll keep doing it when the payment goes away. And there's a lot of different ideas out there about how you do that. But I think some of it has to do with those payments kind of reducing over time. Maybe it's a longer program and the payments start to kind of back off over time. That might be one way to solve that. Another problem is when we're only paying someone for 1 or 2 years, there's not time for them to see the returns. And so not only have you squashed that initial intrinsic motivation, you've made them feel like I'm just doing this to get paid, and then you're not giving them enough time to see that return on investment in a way that might compensate for those payments going away. So I think, especially with cover crops, that's one of the biggest problems is the programs are just too short.
All right, so we've had a couple more questions come in and related to some of the resources and references from your presentation and that paper you just mentioned. So I did put your email in the chat. Folks can find you online by searching your name as well to get your email if you'd like to follow up directly to get some of those resources. But thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. This has been fantastic and enlightening. And while hopefully in 8 more years, or at least in 5 more years when your project wraps up, we will still be doing our webinar series and we can invite you back for updates on how that project is turning out.
Sounds
so
great.
With that, I will give you the final word.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. And then I would say just make sure I have the chat saved because I can see what all people were interested in and maybe gather it all once and send it to those who I have addresses for. Pop your address in there, I guess. And then if not, I can just send it to Liz and the team and then make sure it gets around to everyone. But thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So yes, if you'd like to gather those resources, feel free to put your name in the chat. We will get that connected with Dr. Wilson to get you those resources. Thank you again so much. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Yes, you're getting lots of thumbs up and applause here, rightfully so. And yeah, wonderful.